Elena Rossi's hands moved with practiced precision as she folded the delicate pastry dough, her movements as predictable as the ticking of the antique clock on Sweet Retreat's wall. The morning light filtered through flower-dusted windows, casting golden rectangles across her workspace where she'd stood for the past 15 years, creating the same traditional Italian pastries that had made her bakery a local institution. At 38, Elena had mastered every technique her craft demanded. Her cannolis were perfectly crisp, shells golden, and filled with ricotta so smooth it seemed to melt on the tongue. Her tiramisu was flawlessly layered, each spoonful delivering the perfect balance of coffee, mascarpone, and cocoa. Her sfogliatelle were shaped with mathematical precision, each delicate layer flaking away like architectural poetry. Yet as she watched the steady stream of customers through the front window, ordering their usual favorites with satisfied smiles, she felt an familiar ache of emptiness settling in her chest like a stone. This wasn't how it was supposed to feel. Elena remembered being 12 years old, standing on a wooden stool beside her Nonna Sofia in the cramped kitchen of their family home, watching in wonder as her grandmother's weathered hands transformed simple ingredients into something magical. The kitchen had always smelled of vanilla and cinnamon, of rising bread and bubbling sauces, but more than that, it had been filled with an energy that Elena could only describe as joy made tangible. Nana never followed recipes exactly. She'd taste, adjust, add a pinch of this or a dash of that, always with a mischievous glint in her dark eyes. Her movements had been like a dance, fluid and intuitive, as if she were conducting an orchestra of flavors. She would hum while she worked, old Italian folk songs that seemed to infuse the food with an extra layer of warmth and comfort. Cucina del cuore, Nana would whisper, tapping her chest with a flour-dusted finger. Cook from the heart, piccola. The recipe is just the beginning. The real magic, it comes from here. She would gesture to her heart, then to the air around them, as if the kitchen itself were alive with possibilities. But Nonna Sofia had been gone for 7 years now, and with her went the secrets of her legendary cooking. Elena had inherited her grandmother's sparse recipe journal, a leather-bound book filled with cryptic notes and measurements that seemed to lead nowhere. The pages were yellowed with age and stained with ingredients from decades of use, but they felt incomplete, as if the most important parts had been written in invisible ink. Most frustrating of all was the complete absence of any mention of Nana's most famous creation, the mythical sunlight tart that people still talked about decades later. Elena had heard the stories countless times, how a single bite could transport you back to your happiest childhood memory, how it seemed to glow with its own inner light, how grown men would weep with joy after tasting it. But despite Elena's countless attempts to recreate it, combining every possible ingredient she could imagine, nothing came close to the legends. The journal offered no clues, just a blank page where the recipe should have been, with only a small pencil sketch of what looked like musical notes in the corner. Elena had stared at that page for hours over the years, willing it to reveal its secrets, but it remained stubbornly blank, mocking her with its emptiness. Her regular customers had no idea about her internal struggles. To them, Elena was the reliable baker who provided consistently excellent pastries, the woman who knew their orders by heart and greeted them with a warm smile every morning. They saw success, a thriving business, awards from local food magazines, a reputation that extended far beyond their small town. But Elena felt like she was slowly suffocating under the weight of their expectations. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Elena from her thoughts. Mrs. Gable entered, as she had every morning for the past 3 months, her silver hair neatly pinned in an elegant chignon and her kind eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was perhaps 70, with a sort of timeless elegance that suggested she had been beautiful in her youth and had aged into something even more striking. She reminded Elena so much of her late Aunt Clara that it sometimes took her breath away, the same graceful posture, the same knowing smile, the same way of looking at the world, as if she could see magic hidden in ordinary things. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Gable said softly, approaching the counter with her usual gentle smile. Her voice carried the faint trace of an accent that Elena couldn't quite place, Something European but refined. The usual, please. Elena nodded, reaching for the specialty coffee blend Mrs. Gable always ordered, a complex mixture of Ethiopian and Colombian beans that Elena had to special order from 3 different suppliers. The combination was unusual, almost experimental, requiring specific roasting temperatures and brewing methods that Elena had spent weeks perfecting when Mrs. Gable first requested it. It was an expensive, time-consuming request, but Mrs. Gable paid without question and always left a generous tip that more than compensated for the extra effort. As Elena prepared the coffee, grinding the beans with careful attention to the coarseness, she noticed Mrs. Gable's peculiar ritual. The older woman would always place a single, strangely shaped sugar cube on the counter, not perfectly square like normal sugar, but crafted into an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to catch and reflect light in impossible ways. The cubes were works of art, each one slightly different, carved with tiny symbols and designs that hurt Elena's eyes if she stared too long. Mrs. Gable never used the sugar cube in her coffee, just left it there like some sort of offering, like incense left at a shrine. Elena had tried to refuse them at first, insisting that the customer should keep her expensive artisanal sugar, but Mrs. Gable had been gently persistent. "Are you sure you don't want this in your coffee?" Elena asked, as she had many times before, holding up the current cube, this one carved with what looked like tiny musical notes spiraling around its surface. Mrs. Gable's eyes crinkled with amusement, the sort of expression worn by someone who knew a delightful secret. "Oh no, dear. That's not for the coffee. That's for you to discover when you're ready." Elena had grown used to Mrs. Gable's cryptic responses. She assumed the woman was simply eccentric, perhaps lonely, creating little rituals to make their daily interaction more memorable. Wealthy retirees sometimes developed odd habits, Elena reasoned, and if leaving decorative sugar cubes made Mrs. Gable happy, it was a harmless quirk. Elena would always pocket the sugar cube out of politeness, though she never quite knew what to do with them. They seemed too beautiful to use, too mysterious to throw away, so she had been collecting them in a small jar in her kitchen at home. After Mrs. Gable left, taking her coffee and leaving behind another puzzling sugar cube, Elena returned to her baking, trying to push away the growing sense of restlessness that had been building for months. The annual local food festival was approaching, just 2 weeks away, and she was expected to participate with her traditional offerings. The same cannolis and tiramisu that had won her second place for the past 5 years running. Second place. Always second place. First place invariably went to Marcello's, the established Italian restaurant across town run by a family that had immigrated from Sicily 3 generations ago. Their authentic, old-world approach always edged out Elena's more refined techniques, and she had begun to suspect that the judges valued tradition over innovation, story over skill. Elena's frustration bubbled over as she kneaded the dough more aggressively than necessary, her knuckles white with the effort. She was tired of being predictable, tired of playing it safe, tired of living in the shadow of her grandmother's legend without any of her creative fire. What was the point of having inherited Nana's journal if she couldn't access its secrets? What was the point of being called a master baker if she felt like a fraud? The new fusion bakery that had opened across town wasn't helping her mood. Whisk and Wonder boasted wildly experimental flavors and Instagram-worthy presentations that drew long lines of young customers eager to try lavender honey macarons and matcha white chocolate croissants. Elena had visited once, purely for research purposes, and had been simultaneously impressed and intimidated by their fearless creativity. She knew she could create innovative flavors too. She had the technical skills and the imagination, but every time she considered departing from her traditional menu, she heard the voice of her first mentor, Chef Lombardi, warning her about the dangers of abandoning proven recipes for untested experiments. "A bakery is not a laboratory," he had said. "Customers want reliability, not surprises." But Elena was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, she needed more surprises in her life. Later that afternoon, while restocking supplies in the cramped storage room behind the kitchen, Elena's foot caught on a loose floorboard. As she steadied herself against the shelves, her hand brushed against something warm hidden behind a row of tea containers. The warmth was so unexpected that she jerked her hand back, thinking she had touched a heating pipe or electrical wire. Curious and slightly alarmed, she moved the tins aside and discovered a small wooden box, no larger than her palm, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. The box was surprisingly warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight for hours, though this corner of the storage room never received direct light and was typically one of the coldest spots in the building. Elena lifted the box carefully, marveling at the craftsmanship. The wood was dark, almost black, but with a grain that seemed to flow like water, and the surface was smooth as silk. As she traced the carved patterns with her fingertip, she realized they weren't random decorations. They were musical notes, so tiny and delicate she had to squint to make them out. The notes seemed to form measures of music, flowing around the box in an endless spiral that made her slightly dizzy to follow. Elena turned the box over in her hands, looking for a way to open it, but it seemed to be carved from a single piece of wood with no visible seams or hinges. She shook it gently, but heard nothing rattling inside. The weight was strange, too. Sometimes it felt light as air, other times surprisingly heavy, as if its contents were shifting based on some invisible force. Probably just an old decorative piece, she reasoned, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow significant. Maybe it had belonged to the previous owner of the building, or perhaps it was a prop from the antique shop that had occupied this space before Elena bought it. But why was it warm? And why did the musical notes seem so familiar, as if she had heard the melody they represented in a half-remembered dream? She placed the box on the counter and tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept drifting back to it. There was something hypnotic about the way the carved notes seemed to flow across its surface, forming patterns that looked almost like sheet music for a song she couldn't quite remember. The warmth it radiated was comforting, like holding a cup of hot tea on a cold day, and Elena found herself reaching out to touch it whenever she passed by. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge that would change everything. Elena's expensive coffee grinder, the digital, programmable machine that had served her faithfully for years, chose that moment to emit a series of angry beeps before displaying an error message and refusing to work. The display showed a cascade of error codes that meant nothing to Elena, and pressing buttons only made the beeping more insistent. With Mrs. Gable due for her usual visit in less than an hour and no time to call for repairs, Elena felt a surge of panic. The older woman's coffee blend required precise grinding, and Elena had no idea where to find a replacement machine on such short notice. Then she remembered seeing an old hand-cranked grinder in the storage room, relegated to a high shelf behind boxes of seasonal decorations. The antique grinder was beautiful in its simplicity, cast iron with intricate Victorian-era engravings and a large wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. Elena had assumed it was broken when she first discovered it, just another piece of equipment abandoned by the previous tenant, but when she tested it with a handful of beans, it worked perfectly, producing a rich, aromatic grind that seemed somehow superior to her modern machine. But there was something else, something that made Elena pause and listen carefully. As she turned the handle, the grinder produced a series of soft clicks and chimes, rhythmic and musical, almost like a melody. The sound was subtle, barely audible over the grinding of the beans, but definitely present. Different beans seemed to create different tones, and Elena found herself grinding slowly, listening to the subtle symphony the machine created. The Ethiopian beans produced bright, crystalline notes, while the Colombian beans created deeper, more resonant tones. When she mixed them together, the harmony was unexpectedly beautiful, like a duet between two skilled musicians. Elena had never noticed such nuances in coffee grinding before, and she wondered if all hand-cranked grinders produced music, or if this one was somehow special. When Mrs. Gable arrived for her morning coffee, Elena explained about the broken grinder and apologized for any difference in taste. But as she prepared the special blend using the hand-cranked grinder, she noticed something remarkable. The clicks and chimes seemed to harmonize with the musical notes carved into the mysterious wooden box, creating a rhythm that felt familiar yet impossible to place. Elena found herself grinding in time with the melody she imagined the box represented, and the coffee that resulted was unlike anything she had ever produced. The aroma was richer, more complex, with notes she couldn't identify, but that made her mouth water. She poured it carefully into Mrs. Gable's cup, hoping the older woman wouldn't notice any difference in her precious routine. Mrs. Gable took a sip of her coffee and smiled more broadly than Elena had ever seen. Her eyes widened slightly, and she made a small sound of pleasure that was almost musical in itself. "Oh my," she said, her voice filled with genuine delight. "Now that's much better. You're getting closer, dear." "Closer to what?" Elena asked, but Mrs. Gable had already placed her daily sugar cube on the counter and was heading toward the door with her characteristic graceful stride. "You'll know when you're ready," came the cryptic reply, followed by the gentle chime of the bell. Elena stared at the sugar cube, this one even more intricately carved than the others. The patterns weren't random, they were musical notations, just like the ones on the wooden box. And was it her imagination, or did it seem to pulse with a faint, warm light, like a tiny star captured in crystallized sugar? Over the following days, Elena found herself becoming obsessed with the connections she was beginning to see. The wooden box, the antique grinder, Mrs. Gable's sugar cubes, they all seemed to be part of some larger puzzle that she was slowly piecing together. She began to pay closer attention to the sounds the grinder made, trying to identify the melodies hidden in its mechanical rhythm. She also began to experiment with her regular coffee service, using the hand-cranked grinder for other customers and noting their reactions. The responses were subtle but consistent. People seemed to enjoy their coffee more, staying longer at the small tables she had set up, engaging in more animated conversations. Several regular customers commented that her coffee tasted different, better somehow, though they couldn't explain exactly how. That afternoon, curiosity finally overcame caution. Elena waited until the bakery was empty, then retrieved the hand-cranked grinder and one of Mrs. Gable's sugar cubes. She had been collecting them for weeks now, and they filled a small jar with their strange, crystalline beauty. Each one was unique, carved with different patterns and symbols, but all seemed to follow the same musical theme. The cube she selected was particularly intricate, with notes that seemed to spiral around its surface in a complex fugue. It was harder than normal sugar, more like crystallized honey, and as she placed it in the grinder, her heart raced with anticipation. What would happen? What was she expecting to discover? The first turn of the handle produced a sound unlike anything she'd heard before, not the usual grinding noise, but a pure, crystalline chime that seemed to resonate through her bones. The note was perfect, like a tuning fork struck in a cathedral, and it filled the bakery with harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate with music. As she continued turning the handle, the chimes formed a melody, sweet and haunting, that brought tears to her eyes, though she couldn't say why. The tune was familiar yet impossible to place, like a lullaby from childhood or a song heard in dreams. Each turn of the handle produced new notes, and Elena found herself grinding in rhythm with the music, her movements becoming part of the performance. Suddenly, a soft projection appeared on the wall behind the grinder, symbols and patterns that danced in the air like holographic butterflies. The images were translucent, shifting and changing, showing musical notations that seemed to write themselves in golden light. Elena blinked, certain she was hallucinating, but the projection remained, growing brighter and more detailed. She saw symbols she didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and behind it all, the faint outline of a recipe written in handwriting that looked achingly familiar. The scent in the air changed too, becoming something beyond the usual coffee aroma. It was the smell of sunshine and laughter, of summer afternoons and her grandmother's kitchen, of something she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it. The projection lasted only moments before fading, but the memory of it burned bright in Elena's mind. She had witnessed something impossible, something that defied explanation, and yet she knew with absolute certainty that it was real. The sugar cube had been completely ground, transformed into a powder that sparkled with the same golden light she had seen in the projection. The days that followed were a blur of experimentation and growing obsession. Elena found herself staying late at the bakery, grinding different combinations of beans and sugar cubes, trying to recreate that moment of magic. Each attempt produced different melodies, different scents, different fleeting projections on the wall, but none quite matched the transcendent experience of that first try. She began to notice that certain combinations produced stronger effects. The sugar cubes with more complex musical notations created longer, more detailed projections. Specific types of beans seemed to enhance the magical properties. The Ethiopian beans produced bright, celebratory visions, while the Colombian beans created deeper, more emotional experiences. Meanwhile, her regular baking began to suffer from her distraction. She burned a batch of biscotti, while mesmerized by the patterns the grinder projected onto the wall. She oversalted a batch of focaccia because she was listening to the rhythm of the kneading instead of paying attention to the recipe. Her cannoli shells came out unevenly shaped because she was thinking about the musical possibilities of different ingredients. Her customers began to notice the changes, some commenting that her pastries seemed different, though they couldn't quite say how. Mrs. Patterson, who had been buying her morning cornetto for a decade, mentioned that it tasted more emotional than usual. Mr. Ricci, a retired music teacher, swore he could hear faint melodies in the layers of her tiramisu. Elena's frustration reached its peak 3 days before the food festival. She had been experimenting with a new combination of sugar cubes when disaster struck. Her supply of regular sugar ran out completely. The delivery truck was late due to a traffic accident, and she was faced with the prospect of closing early or using the emergency supply she kept for such situations. But her emergency supply was also exhausted, used up in her late-night experiments. Panic set in as she realized she had nothing to sweeten her afternoon batch of pastries. Then she remembered the bag of unlabeled sugar she'd found while cleaning out her Aunt Clara's cottage after her death 2 years ago. Aunt Clara had been Elena's favorite relative, a woman who had never married but had lived a life full of adventure and creativity. She had been a chef herself, though she had worked in experimental restaurants rather than traditional establishments. Her cottage had been filled with unusual ingredients, antique cooking equipment, and journals full of recipes that seemed more like poetry than practical instructions. The sugar Elena had found was unlike any she'd seen before, not pure white but with a subtle golden tint and grains that seemed to catch and reflect light like tiny prisms. It had been stored in an old glass jar with no label, and Elena had assumed it was some sort of specialty sugar that Clara had imported from one of her travels. She had kept it as a memento, never intending to use it, but desperation forced her hand. As she incorporated the strange sugar into her regular recipes, something extraordinary happened. The pastries began to take on a luminous quality, their surfaces gleaming with an inner light that seemed to come from within. The flavors became deeper and more complex than anything she'd created before, with layers of taste that revealed themselves slowly, like a symphony unfolding movement by movement. Customers who had been ordering the same items for years suddenly stopped mid-bite, their eyes widening in wonder. The reactions were immediate and dramatic. People began to smile involuntarily, their faces lighting up with joy that seemed to radiate from within. "Elena," gasped Mrs. Patterson, her usual reserved demeanor completely forgotten. "This tastes like sunshine, like happiness itself. What did you do differently?" Elena couldn't answer because she didn't fully understand it herself. All she knew was that Aunt Clara's sugar seemed to unlock something in her baking, bringing out flavors and emotions she'd never been able to access before. The pastries didn't just taste good, they seemed to carry messages, to tell stories, to connect with something deep in the human heart. Word spread quickly through the small town. By evening, Elena had a line of customers stretching around the block, all wanting to try the miraculous pastries that were apparently capable of inducing euphoria. Local food bloggers arrived with cameras, and Elena found herself giving impromptu interviews about her secret ingredient, while having no idea what to say. The night before the food festival, Elena couldn't sleep. She found herself in the bakery at 2 a.m, staring at the wooden box, the antique grinder, and the remaining sugar cubes from Mrs. Gable's daily visits. There was a connection between them. She was certain of it now, but she couldn't see the pattern. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but she couldn't understand how they fit together. On impulse, She arranged the sugar cubes in a line according to the musical notations carved into each one. They formed a sequence, a melody that matched the notes on the wooden box. With trembling hands, she began to grind them in order, using the hand-cranked grinder and listening to the chimes it produced. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, complex and layered, unlike anything she'd ever heard. Each sugar cube contributed its own voice to the symphony, creating harmonies that seemed to build upon themselves, growing richer and more complex with each addition. As the final note faded, something incredible happened. The wooden box began to glow with a warm, golden light, the same light she'd seen in the projections. Elena watched in amazement as it opened, not with hinges or latches, but simply unfolding like a flower made of wood and dreams. The light that emerged was not harsh but gentle, like candlelight or sunset, and it filled the bakery with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Inside the box was a small compartment lined with what looked like crystallized starlight. The walls of the compartment were covered in the same musical notations that decorated the outside, but these were three-dimensional, standing out from the surface like tiny sculptures. At the center of the compartment was a single sheet of paper, aged and yellowed, covered in handwriting that made Elena's heart skip a beat. It was her grandmother's familiar script, the same handwriting she had seen in the recipe journal, but this was different. The words seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the paper itself felt warm to the touch. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, La Ricetta del Sol, the recipe of the sun. Elena's hands shook as she read her grandmother's words, not just ingredients and measurements, but a philosophy of cooking that spoke to everything she'd been searching for. Nana Sophia had written about the music of flavors, about ingredients that sang together in harmony, about the importance of cooking with joy and wonder rather than just following instructions. Cooking is not just about feeding the body, the recipe began, but about nourishing the soul. The true chef understands that every ingredient has its own song, its own story to tell. When you cook with love, with attention, with respect for the magic that lives in simple things, you create more than food. You create memories, emotions, connections between hearts. The recipe itself was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. It included standard ingredients, flour, eggs, butter, sugar, but also instructions for things that seemed impossible. Add 3 measures of morning sunlight, captured in golden sugar. Fold in the sound of laughter, crystallized in musical cubes. Bake until the tart sings with joy. But there was more. A note at the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, her Aunt Clara's familiar script. For Elena, when she's ready to remember that cooking is magic, and magic is real. I have prepared everything you need to continue what Nana Sophia began. The final key is in the golden sugar I saved for you. Trust the music. Trust your heart. Trust the recipe that lives inside you. Elena looked up from the paper to find Mrs. Gable standing in the doorway, no longer the quiet, mysterious customer, but smiling with the warmth of someone who had been waiting patiently for this moment. The older woman had somehow entered the bakery without Elena hearing the bell, and she stood there as if she'd been expected, as if this meeting had been planned for years. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Gable said softly, her voice carrying new layers of meaning. "I think it's time we talked properly." Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. You knew all along." Mrs. Gable nodded, moving closer with the same graceful stride Elena had watched every morning for months. "I was your Aunt Clara's dearest friend. We met in culinary school 40 years ago, back when we were both young and full of dreams about changing the world through food. She asked me to watch over you, to guide you when you were ready to discover what she and your Nana Sophia had prepared for you. The sugar cubes, the coffee blend, the timing of your visits. All part of their plan," Mrs. Gable confirmed. "Clara knew you had inherited your grandmother's gift, but she also knew you'd buried it under years of playing it safe, of following other people's expectations instead of your own heart. She designed this entire experience to bring back your sense of wonder, to remind you that the best recipes aren't just about ingredients, they're about magic." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, years of frustration and longing finally finding release. But why the mystery? Why not just tell me? Mrs. Gable smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same mischief Elena remembered from her grandmother. Because the discovery had to be yours. The magic only works when it comes from genuine curiosity, from the willingness to experiment and trust your instincts. If we had simply handed you the recipe, it would have been just another set of instructions to follow. But this way, you've learned to listen to the music and the ingredients, to feel the magic in the process. Elena looked down at the recipe in her hands, then at the golden sugar, the musical box, and the antique grinder. "The sunlight tart," she whispered. "Your grandmother's masterpiece," Mrs. Gable confirmed. "But more than that, it's a doorway. A way to create food that doesn't just nourish the body, but feeds the soul." Clara added her own innovations, ways to make the magic stronger, more accessible. The hand-cranked grinder, the musical sugar cubes, the golden sweetener. All tools to help you find your way back to cooking with wonder. Elena spent the rest of the night reading and rereading the recipe, understanding finally that it wasn't just about creating a dessert, it was about creating an experience. The ingredients were important, but the true magic came from the joy and intention she brought to the process. Every step was accompanied by musical notations, suggestions for the rhythm of mixing, the melody of whisking, the harmony of flavors coming together. When morning came, Elena was ready. She prepared for the food festival with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Instead of her usual safe offerings, she decided to debut the sunlight tart, following her grandmother's recipe but adding her own intuitive touches, guided by the music of the grinder and the warm glow of the wooden box. The preparation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As she worked, she could hear the ingredients singing to each other, the golden sugar harmonizing with the eggs, the butter providing a rich bass note to the flour's bright soprano. The antique grinder became her conductor's baton, helping her find the perfect rhythm for each step. The festival was crowded, filled with the usual array of local businesses showcasing their best products. Elena's booth drew curious visitors who were intrigued by the unusual setup, the antique grinder, the musical notations displayed as decoration, the mysterious golden pastries that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The first customer to try the sunlight tart was a young mother with her 6-year-old daughter. She took a bite and immediately closed her eyes, a look of pure wonder crossing her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It tastes like being 7 years old again, helping my grandmother make cookies." Tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I can smell her perfume. I can hear her humming. How is this possible?" Word spread quickly through the festival. People began lining up at Elena's booth, drawn by the reports of a pastry that could somehow evoke powerful memories and emotions. Elena watched in amazement as customer after customer experienced their own moments of transcendence, each tasting something different, but equally meaningful. An elderly man claimed it reminded him of his wedding day, and he began to describe the taste of his late wife's kiss. A teenager said it tasted like her first kiss, and she blushed with the memory. A businessman in an expensive suit took one bite and began laughing with pure joy, saying it reminded him of playing in the rain as a child, of a time when the world had seemed infinite with possibility. The reactions were so dramatic that a crowd gathered just to watch people eat the tart. Food critics who had come to cover the festival found themselves abandoning their notebooks to simply observe the magic happening at Elena's booth. Several people asked if they could buy the recipe, offering ridiculous sums of money, but Elena knew instinctively that this was something that couldn't be sold. It had to be earned, discovered, felt. Mrs. Gable appeared at Elena's side as the afternoon sun began to set, bringing with her a sense of completion, of a circle finally closed. "So," she said with a knowing smile, "how does it feel to be a magician?" Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "It feels like coming home. Like I've been sleepwalking for the past 15 years and finally woke up." "Your grandmother would be so proud," Mrs. Gable said, her voice thick with emotion. "And Clara, too. They both knew you had this gift. You just needed to remember how to use it." As the festival wound down, Elena found herself surrounded by people asking when they could try more of her magical creations, requesting custom orders for special occasions, and begging to know the secret of the sunlight tart. She realized that her life had just changed completely, and for the first time in years, she felt excited about the future instead of trapped by it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of transformation. Elena redesigned Sweet Retreat, incorporating elements of her grandmother's and aunt's magical approach to cooking. She created a melody menu, where customers could choose their orders based on musical themes, each dish designed to evoke specific emotions and memories. The wooden box became the centerpiece of her display, and she learned to use the antique grinder to create custom spice blends that literally sang with flavor. Mrs. Gable became her unofficial partner, sharing stories of Clara's innovations and helping Elena understand the deeper principles behind magical cooking. Elena discovered that the magic wasn't limited to the sunlight tart. Every recipe could be infused with music, with intention, with the kind of love that transforms simple ingredients into something transcendent. She learned to listen to the rhythm of rising dough, to feel the harmony of complementary flavors, to understand that cooking was indeed a form of music and that she had finally found her voice. The bakery became a destination, drawing visitors from across the country who had heard about the pastry chef who could bake memories and emotions into her creations. Food critics struggled to describe what made Elena's work so special, eventually settling on words like transcendent and life-changing. But the professional recognition, while gratifying, wasn't what mattered most to Elena. What mattered was the moment each morning when she would turn the handle of the antique grinder and listen to the music it created, knowing that she was carrying on a tradition that connected her to her grandmother, her aunt, and the timeless art of cooking with love and wonder. What mattered was the smile on a customer's face when they tasted something that reminded them of their childhood, or the tears of joy when someone experienced a flavor that brought back a cherished memory. She had finally learned what Nana Sophia had tried to teach her all those years ago. The recipe was just the beginning. The real magic happened when you cooked from the heart, when you were willing to experiment and trust your instincts, when you remembered that food was about more than just nutrition. It was about creating moments of joy and connection that could transform lives. Standing in her transformed bakery, surrounded by the tools of her magical trade and the warm glow of satisfied customers, Elena smiled as she prepared for another day of culinary alchemy. She had found her way back to the wonder of cooking, and she would never take it for granted again. The sunlight tart had become more than just a dessert. It was a reminder that magic was real, that tradition was a living thing, and that the most important ingredient in any recipe was the love and intention of the person creating it. Elena had finally learned to cook with her heart, and in doing so, had discovered that she was capable of far more magic than she had ever imagined. The wooden box still sat on her counter, no longer mysterious, but familiar, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought her here. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, she could see new musical notes appearing on its surface, suggestions for future experiments, invitations to discover new forms of culinary magic. And Elena was ready for whatever came next, armed with her grandmother's wisdom, her aunt's creativity, and her own hard-won understanding that the most profound magic was often hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to listen to its song.